Hi guys, this is a small video about validation in .NET Core MVC. In this video, I'll give you an overview and I'll talk specifically about validation attributes. There'll be a second video where I'll talk about how to use the validation attributes for client-side and server-side validation. Okay, so the problem is that if we have an MVC application, we have the client, which is the browser, and we have the server. And we want to validate on the client to make the application more responsive, such that if you type something wrong in a field, you immediately get an indication if it's invalid. We also want to save a server round trip. And since basically what the browser can run is JavaScript, it more or less means the use of JavaScript. We might not want to do that. But we also wish to validate on the server because there are many ways you can actually send input to the server without by bypassing the client-side validation. For instance, you can turn off JavaScript on the browser. So we need both kinds of validation. Okay, and the solution in the .NET framework is that we define validation rules and then we apply these on the client and on the server. This gives us consistent validation. So when we don't have two sets of validation rules, we try to use the same set of validation rules at least. Okay, we do this by using validation attributes. And these are just attributes that inherit from validation attributes. They can be applied to properties of a class and to the class as a whole, and I think also to fields, maybe. I'm not quite sure, but the usual place you use them is for properties and classes. Okay, and here's an example. And I'm going to show you the example here. So we can take this one here. We have a class called person, and we have a property called name. And just above name, we have a required attribute and a string length attribute. We can also take a look down here. We have the age attribute, we have the required attribute again, and we have a range attribute. And you'll notice that depending on the kind of attribute, we have different parameters. Like for instance, here we have the max string length of 120 characters and a minimum length of 2 characters. They wouldn't make sense for the required attribute. Here's another attribute that's not a validation attribute. It's display attribute, and it does not inherit validation attribute. It just inherits attribute. So that's not a validation attribute, as the name also suggests. So you should also notice that even though the attribute class is called range attribute, you only write range. You don't have to write attribute. I think it works still if you write attribute, but you shouldn't write it. Okay, so as I showed you, we apply the validation attributes to the model you use, either to the class or to the individual properties. I didn't show you the class, but this one also has an attribute on it. We'll get back to that. What's important is that you use the attributes to the model you use in a view. So you may have several models like data models, DTO models, but it's always the model you use in a view. We'll get back to that in the next video. Okay, here's a few of the built-in validation attributes. There's a few more than I showed you. Allowed values attribute, for instance, and I would like to emphasize also the regular expression attribute. I won't show an example of that, but this one takes as a parameter a regular expression, and then it checks the input if it matches the regular expression. And if you're good at regular expressions, you can use this. If you're not so good at regular expressions, you can find examples of regular expressions to validate common validations. Like, for instance, to validate whether an email is valid, you can find a regular expression example for that online. Okay, and I would also like to stress that some of these attributes can be used in different contexts. For instance, if you want to have Entity Framework generate a database for you from a model, a data model, the required attribute could be used in that situation also. Okay, so here's the same example I showed you before. So I showed you another example, a couple of them actually. This one, age check. Oh, I wrote attribute, I don't have to do that. And person valid attribute. We'll take a look at those now, because those are not built-in attributes. It's easy to make your own validation attributes. What you need to do is inherit from validation attributes and override the isValid method. That works for server-side validation. It's not very easy to do the same for client-side validation, because you must attach your JavaScript to validation attribute, and this is a somewhat complex procedure. But what are custom validation attributes? Here's an example of one. So I make a class, it's called ageCheck attribute. It inherits validation attribute, and I override the isValid method. So what this one just returns false if the person is less than 18. So you need to be at least 18 for this one to return true. I could have done this by using the range attribute, but the point is that the validation could be more complex. So you might want to make your own. Like, for instance, if you had the age had to be in 2 or 3 intervals, I don't think that there's a built-in attribute to check that. So you can use this ageCheck attribute like here. Or you should use attribute. You should remove attribute. And we can see age here it is. So it's just a simple class. There's also person valid attribute. This is slightly more complex. I still inherit validation attribute, but in this case I take out the entire object. The value is the entire object, as opposed to this one where value is just the value of the age that the user entered. Here it's the entire person that the user entered. So I cast that value to person, and then I can check the name and the age, and I can do some sort of logic between more than one property. For instance, if you're above the age of 14, you shouldn't call yourself Superman. That's childish. Or you could check anything, like the time of the day, or look in a database and see if that person actually exists, or anything. So to ensure that this one is used on a class, I can put this attribute on the attribute, whereas this one is supposed to be used on a property. So let's see the example, the person valid attribute. This is a very short introduction. There's a lot to be said about this, and there's a lot of built-in attributes. and there's a lot I didn't tell you. So this is just an overview. Okay, see you in the next video. Thank you.